Hello everybody, this is Mr. Schultz, and this is the Module 14 quiz review. So we're going to go through this question by question, starting with number 1, which is what are homologous structures? Provide an example of homologous structures. So a homologous structure is anatomically similar similar structure inherited from a common ancestor. An example that we looked at in class is the pentadactyl limb. It's an example because all vertebrate land animals have the same basic bone structure in their limbs. It's just been modified over time to look different for their environment. That's a homologous structure. Another homologous structure might be like a backbone, or the fact that we have a jaw. That is a homologous structure. It's something that we all have that came from an ancestor. So that's question number 1, which is what are homologous structures, and provide an example. Now, 2 says what is an analogous structure? Well, an analogous structure provides an example, and provide an example, right? So the structure that has the same function but different construction and was not inherited from a common ancestor. We talked about a couple of different analogous structures in class, but the biggest one is like flippers and fins and sharks and dolphins. But another one might be like the wings of a butterfly or any other insect compared to the wings of a bird. Those two structures are analogous. They don't come from the same original structure. They actually come from two different structures that are converging together to do a similar property. And so another example actually is bird and bat wings. They're both pentadactyl limbs, but one came from an animal that changed over time to develop flight like a bird. And then the wings of a bat actually came about later as an adaptation than birds did. And so it actually comes from an animal that probably walked on the ground or climbed in trees and eventually built up that skin around its long, thin fingers. So analogous structures that have the same function but different construction, and they're not inherited from a common ancestor. So that's 2. Now 3 says we want to believe that amphibians are descendants of lobe-finned fish. We now believe, okay? One example of a transitional fossil is called Tiktaalik. The picture, by the way, is Tiktaalik. The fossil record shows a variety of changes over time that can be classified as either ancestral traits or derived traits. So Tiktaalik have fins, gills, and scales like a fish, but they also have a sturdy rib cage and mobile neck like present-day amphibians. So the first question says, hey, define ancestral traits. Well, ancestral traits are a more primitive or basic characteristic that appeared in common ancestors. And then we have the second part, which is identify the ancestral traits. In Tiktaalik, it's simply just fins, gills, and scales. They're things that had come before that Tiktaalik still has, but aren't anything new. They're just old traits that they still have. They're still useful to them, at least at this time. And so C says, hey, define the derived traits. So we have ancestral traits that come from our ancestors, things that already showed up, and derived, which come as new. And so the derived traits are a new feature that has not appeared in common ancestors. And so an example of this is going to be the sturdy rib cage and mobile neck. These are new traits that did not show up before. Before Tiktaalik, we have no fossil record of any organism that had the ability to move its head on its neck. It was always stuck in place. And if you look at a fish, they can't move their neck to turn their head. They have to turn their whole body, basically. And fish don't have a sturdy rib cage. Their ribs are really, really thin and really weak. And so Tiktaalik's rib cage was actually pretty sturdy and solid. And so that's when we talk about ancestral, comes from our ancestors. It's a trait that's been there before, and derived are new traits that have not shown up before. And so these are examples of ancestral and derived traits. Question 4 talks about the whale. Okay, so it says, observe the picture to the right of the whale skeleton and note the small hind limbs in the image and answer the following 2 questions. The first is, hey, define vestigial structure. A vestigial structure is simply just a reduced form of a functional structure that indicates shared ancestry. Sorry, I'm moving my camera a little bit to make it a little easier to see. And so the vestigial structure in whales are their back legs. Their back legs and their pelvis aren't really around anymore. They're still in the skeleton. Like if you were to take apart a whale, you would still find these bones, but whales don't need these back legs anymore. And so what happened is, to explain the advantage for not having back legs, well, because they live in water and they don't need those back legs dragging them around. And so they create drag, they slow the whale down, so not having back legs makes sense. Instead, they use their tail to move, and their tail moves up and down and pushes water. So the back legs, not needed anymore. An example of a vestigial structure in humans is a tailbone. We don't have a tail anymore, so we don't really need the bone for it. Question number 5 talks about identifying the differences between natural selection and artificial selection. And the easiest thing to remember is natural selection is nature controlled and artificial selection is human controlled. So the first example says, hey, 2 winning Arabian horses are bred to make horses that are faster and more likely to win races as well. Well, we are the ones that are breeding the horses, so that's artificial selection. Birds of paradise with the brightest feathers tend to mate more often and lead to more baby birds with brighter feathers. That's natural selection. We're not selecting for the bird feathers. The birds are selecting for it, so they're naturally picking out the colors they want. Spring peeper frogs, which are the frogs you hear early in spring that are really loud. They're chirpy. You can sometimes hear them around ponds, and even like they sometimes live in bigger puddles. So spring peepers with the loudest mating call tend to get eaten by predators, and those who are too quiet don't attract a mate. The frogs with the medium volume chirp, they reproduce the most often. They're not getting eaten. They're also not being ignored. That's natural selection. And then our final example are ragdoll cats, which are born with shorter legs than normal. It is common for people to breed 2 ragdoll cats together, so they get kittens with the same trait, and then they can sell those kittens for a little bit more money. This is an example of an artificial selection. It's something humans do. Okay, so just keep in mind, artificial means we're doing it. Humans are causing the change, and natural is where nature is causing the change. Okay, now 6 says define the following evolutionary processes, provide an example, or draw a picture to help you remember each. And so our first process is adaptive radiation, which is the rapid development of new species due to changes in the environment or new opportunities. And the examples we saw in class are Darwin's finches, and then in the book they mentioned Lake Victoria cichlids. It's believed that the only fish that first got into Lake Victoria were the cichlids, and they started out as a small group of fish that got into there through probably a flood or something else. And over time, the cichlids took over the lake and developed traits to help them live in different parts of the lake and eat different things. There's like big predator cichlids that eat the smaller cichlids, and there are cichlids that live at the bottom and are like catfish. And there are cichlids that live at the top and eat small organisms like phytoplankton and stuff. And there's this whole food web of just cichlids that are at one point related to each other and are now completely separate species. There's a whole cool story about Lake Victoria and an invasive species, which is a concept from first module or from the first trimester. That's really cool to look at. It kind of messes with the cichlids and it changes things around. Coevolution is when organisms that rely on each other evolve together. And the book example is like hummingbirds and deeper flowers. Hummingbirds develop that long, thin beak to eat out of flowers, and the flowers themselves developed over time to be relatively flat to these deeper flowers, which help protect like the inner parts of the flower from wind and damage and maybe predators. Another vocab term that we ran into is called convergent evolution. We saw this earlier in our review. And so the example, the definition is when organisms that live in different regions of the world develop similar traits due to similar climates or environments. These should be reviewed, by the way. These are on our warm-up. One example that I have, I ran out of space for any more, are flying squirrels in North America and sugar gliders in Australia. They developed separately, even though they're both mammals. Flying squirrels are like us. They have live young and then raise them. and they're fairly well developed when they're born. Sugar gliders are marsupials, and their babies are born underdeveloped, and then they spend some time living in the pouch of their mom. And so sugar gliders are a marsupial, and flying squirrels are a normal mammal. That's convergent evolution. They didn't come from each other, but they both developed the ability to glide from one tree to another over time. The last word, second to last word, we got two. Gradualism is the theory that describes evolution as a slow process that can lead to the development of new species. And the picture I drew is a phylogenetic tree showing these slow branches coming off. And so gradualism is a slow evolution where things very slowly change over time. An organism might develop a new trait. It takes generation after generation for that trait to really become popular, or maybe it isn't popular and it gets wiped out. Punctuated equilibrium is the theory that describes rapid development of the new species followed by long periods of change. Now, to help you remember gradualism and punctuated, gradual equals slow, and punctuated equals rapid. So punctual, rapid, gradual, slow. And I drew another type of phylogenetic tree where it shows like these massive jumps in time, whereas this is just really slowly branching. We're still trying to figure this out. More than likely, evolution works in both ways a little bit, and this is kind of one of those theories, or two theories, that need to slowly but surely be kind of pushed together at times. Generally, we don't like punctuated equilibrium as much because the idea is like something jump and then like it doesn't change at all. It just like starts out this way and then it just jumps and stays that way for forever until it goes extinct. We don't really think that. We think gradualism is probably more likely, but punctuated equilibrium has some benefits. Like it tends to explain adaptive radiation better. But I'm getting off topic. So let's take a look at the next page. All right, so question 7 says identify and explain the 4 parts of Darwin's theory of natural selection. And so the first part of Darwin's theory of natural selection is that a population needs to have variation. It needs to have traits. Individuals in a population must differ from one another. They can't be perfect clones. If they're all identical, evolution, natural selection can't happen. Okay? So keep in mind, Darwin's theory of natural selection is not evolution totally. It is part of evolution. It's kind of like one of the first building blocks, but it does not explain everything. So first part, variation. Second part, heritability. Some variations or traits have to be inherited by the offspring. So in other words, parents need to be able to pass on these variations, these traits, these adaptations. These 3 words, by the way, are basically mean the same thing. And so parents need to be able to pass on these traits, these differences between each other. Then we have overproduction. Darwin figured out that populations will always produce more offspring than can actually survive, which seems weird for humans. We tend to raise our young till they're old enough to have kids of their own. But if you think of like a dandelion, and a dandelion starts out as that yellow flower and then it turns into the puffball, that puffball will release hundreds of seeds, but only a couple of the seeds end up becoming adults and get to grow into their own thing. The rest of them just die or get destroyed over time. So all populations will produce more offspring than can actually survive. The last part of Darwin's theory of natural selection is that some variations or traits or adaptations allow the organism that possesses them to have more offspring than the organism that does not possess them. In other words, this is fitness. Okay? Where organisms that have enough traits to help them survive are more likely to and pass on their traits. That's all fitness is. It's like, oh, hey, congratulations. You survived and you were able to pass on your genes. Well, now you're part of the survival of the fittest. You're part of natural selection now. Okay, so that's question number 7. That's just walking us through Darwin's different parts of his theory. 8 says, what evidence did Darwin collect on his trip? Well, 1, he collected fossil evidence of giant armadillos as compared to the ones we see today. So that told him that, hey, armadillos might be a species that's changed from before to now. He also got to the Galapagos Islands and he started to compare the anatomical features of finches from the Galapagos. Anatomical means body structure, okay? So he looked at the beaks mostly of the finches, and what he found is that all the finches looked similar in terms of like their facial structure and their body structure, but their beaks were all a little bit different. And so like one group had these really big strong beaks and others had these like really thin and narrow beaks, and there were some that were kind of in between. And so when we think of birds, they have different traits. And so in this case, Darwin saw all these different types of finches, and he kind of worked with the idea that they all came from one original finch. The last piece of evidence that he really looked at was the biogeographical evidence that compared changes in the Earth to changes in organisms on the planet. So this is where Wallace kind of came in too, where they look at different organisms in different parts of the planet and compared where they came from, what similarities they had, what differences they had. Like they noticed, oh, hey, Australia's got all these marsupials, and there's just one in North America and South America, and that's just the possum. And like, what's going on with that? So there had to be some sort of change, some change in the environment. The change in the Earth caused a change in the organisms. And so that's number 8. Number 9 and 10 are fairly straightforward. 9 says, hey, what is camouflage? And give 2 examples. Camouflage is a morphological adaptation that allows an organism to blend into its environment. In other words, it can hide really well. Morphological is like a fancy word for like body outside traits. Okay, so if you see morphological, we're talking about like the physical traits of the body. The first example is the one from the book. It's just a yellow spider just hanging out, hiding in a yellow flower. It blends in. It can capture its prey better because the fly never sees it coming. Example 2 is one I have from personal experience, which is a copperhead snake blends into the dead leaves of a forest floor and hides really, really well. And so when we look at camouflage, we're blending in. Okay? And then 10 says, hey, what is mimicry? And explain the evolutionary advantage to mimicry and provide 2 examples of mimicry. Okay? So it's a morphological adaptation, again, a body adaptation, in which one species evolves to resemble the other. In other words, it looks like something else, which gives it an advantage. One example we used in our book was king snakes. They look like venomous snakes, but they're not. They're harmless. And then the other one we talked about in our warm-up was monarch butterflies and viceroy butterflies. Monarchs are poisonous. They eat poisonous plants. And viceroy butterflies are not poisonous, but they look identical or close to it, to the point that birds can't tell the difference, and they don't eat the viceroys because they look too much like a monarch. Okay, so we just have the last page. 11 is asking us to describe the 3 types of selection, drawing an example of what the population graph looks like, and then provide an example for each type of selection. The first is stabilizing selection. It's the elimination of the extremes. In other words, any extreme trait in a population is eliminated and average is best. This is the most common, by the way. Stabilizing selection tends to be the most common. The example in the book is the average body weight of a human baby. If the baby is low on weight, it tends to not survive as well. And if the baby's too big, it's more likely to cause health complications with the mother, which can lead to complications during birth, and the baby might not make it. Directional selection is when one extreme of the trait is selected for instead of the middle or the other size or other version of the trait. This is like our pom-pom lab, by the way, where black on the black forest floor tended to do better. So in this case, our normal population, our original is the dotted line, and then over time, there's this push, this selection for bigger or darker or lighter or brighter or stronger, just depends on the trait. The example in the book is like bigger beaks can crush tougher seas during a drought year, so you would expect to see more birds with bigger beaks survive, and their population would change over time to see more bigger beaks. The last of the examples, or of the types of selection, is disruptive, and this one always kind of throws people off. It's when the average trait, the middle trait, is selected against instead of either the extreme versions. So snakes, the example the book uses is these snakes. There's green and there's gray. When they breed together, they're the same species, they get an incomplete dominance where both green and gray scales show up. And when you're green, you blend into the grass well. When you're gray, you blend into the rocks well. When you have both green and gray, you tend to stick out like a sore thumb, and you're more easy to see, and then you get eaten. And so the middle group tends to get pushed apart. And so when we see disruptive, we're talking about the middle, the averages being broken apart. Basically, we're splitting the species in half. And that does happen. Sometimes a species gets split in half, and one goes in one way and the other way, and you end up with two completely different species. The movie, or the book, it's really a book first, of The Time Machine talks about humans splitting and going into two groups. One lives underground and is like these terrible meat-eating animals, and the other ones are these innocent people that live on the ground, up on the surface, and they're like sheep. Not a bad read. It's an old sci-fi book. 12 says, hey, use the image provided to answer the following question. So here's my picture, and I color-coded my picture to help me answer this question. I colored the light ones orange and the dark ones purple. So explain the variation that you see in the insect population. Well, they're two different colors. And how does the appearance change over time? Well, at the beginning, they're 50-50, 3 and 3. But over time, the light ones seem to be getting eaten, and the dark ones seem to take over. So eventually we end up with almost all dark, with the occasional light ones still left. And C says, hey, write a claim that clearly states which type of insect is best for survival and why it is the best fit. Well, it seems like the dark beetles are the more fit because they're the ones that aren't getting eaten, so they probably blend in really well. And so the bird sees the really bright orange beetle and goes, ooh, food, and then he eats the beetle. And those orange beetles, they don't always get to reproduce before they get eaten, and so they don't get to become part of the group that survives and passes their traits on. They're no longer fit. The dark ones do survive. They get to pass their traits on. Their traits get passed over time and increase over time until eventually our population is almost all dark beetles. So this is the Module 14 answer key for the quiz review. The quiz is 26 questions. Please make sure that you spend a little bit of time studying this material. I strongly suggest you definitely look through this again. This is really, really important. If you have any questions before the quiz, don't be afraid to ask, and we will try to go through it together if you have additional questions.